In the flat farmland of California's Central Valley, there's a prison that rarely makes the tourist maps, but for decades, it has shaped the way America thinks about maximum security. California State Prison, Corcoran opened in 1988, built on land that was once part of Tulare Lake. On paper, it was designed as a modern facility. Concrete housing units, controlled movement, strict separation between rival groups. But inside, Corcoran quickly developed a different reputation, one that spread far beyond its walls. By the mid-1990s, Corcoran had become known for an alarming pattern. Inmates were being shot by guards at unusually high numbers, often during fights in the exercise yards. News reports, lawsuits, and later a federal investigation raised questions that California could not ignore. Some former staff and investigators described something even darker, not random violence, but a system where certain fights were allowed to happen, and sometimes even encouraged. A prison is supposed to control chaos. So how did Corcoran become a place where chaos seemed to serve a purpose? This documentary explores the real, verified history behind California State Prison, Corcoran, one of the most feared and controversial prisons in the United States. We will look at why Corcoran was built and what kind of prison it was meant to be, how it became linked to extreme violence and intense gang conflict, the allegations of staged fights, guard shootings, and a national scandal, the FBI investigation, federal indictments, and what happened in court, what Corcoran reveals about prison systems, power, and accountability. Everything in this documentary is based on documented reporting, official records, and well-known investigations into Corcoran's history. The goal is education and public understanding, without glorifying crime or violence. Now we begin where Corcoran's reputation first took shape. This documentary is for educational and informational purposes only. All content is based on factual, research-driven information from public records, official documents, court filings, and reporting by reputable media and human rights organizations. No information is intentionally fabricated or exaggerated. Before we proceed, please like, share, comment, and subscribe to support the channel. Corcoran was created during one of the most intense periods in California's incarceration history. In the 1980s, California's prison population was exploding. Tough sentencing policies, the war on drugs, and rising gang activity pushed the state to build new facilities fast. Corcoran was part of that response, another Level 4 prison designed to hold people considered high risk. When Corcoran opened in February 1988, it was meant to be controlled, structured, and secure. But even early on, internal records and later reporting suggested that violence levels were unusually high compared to other prisons. Corcoran didn't just hold people serving long sentences. It also became a key location for people in high-security housing, people considered management problems, and inmates tied to major prison gangs. In California, prison gangs operate differently than street gangs. Inside, they often become structured organizations, enforcing rules through fear, debt, and discipline. In that environment, small disputes can become serious conflicts fast. And Corcoran had another factor that made it uniquely tense. The yard system at prisons like Corcoran, exercise yards are one of the few places inmates leave their cells regularly. That makes the yard both valuable and dangerous. It's where alliances are tested, where conflicts surface, and where staff must maintain order with limited time and limited space. By the early 1990s, Corcoran had developed a reputation among inmates and some staff as a place where the yard could turn into a battleground, especially between rival racial groups and gang factions. And that's important because it leads to the central controversy that would define Corcoran in the public eye. The shootings. Corcoran officers began reporting high numbers of incidents where they used firearms to stop inmate fights in the yard. By the mid-1990s, major reporting described Corcoran as severely troubled, noting that officers had shot and killed more inmates than any prison in the country during its short existence, with multiple deaths and dozens wounded. These shootings became a key reason Corcoran drew intense national attention. At first, the official explanation was straightforward. Inmate fights happened. Guards ordered them to stop. If they didn't stop, guards fired. But critics asked a hard question. If this was simply about breaking up fights, why was Corcoran experiencing so many of these shootings? And then, In the mid-1990s, investigators and journalists began hearing claims that changed the entire story. Some people started calling them Gladiator fights, not because the fights were entertainment in any official way, but because the accusations suggested something unthinkable in a modern U.S. prison. That violence wasn't only failing to be prevented, it might have been managed, used, or even allowed on purpose. Those allegations would soon reach national television, the FBI, and federal court. But first, one more question hangs in the air. If the prison yard was already unstable, what would happen if the people responsible for stopping violence were also being accused of helping it happen? By the mid-1990s, Corcoran was no longer just another high-security prison. It was becoming a symbol of something bigger. What happens when a prison built for control begins operating in permanent crisis? Officially, the violence was blamed on inmate conflict, gang rivalries, racial politics, long sentences, and constant tension. But investigative reporting began to describe a more troubling pattern, one that didn't fit the normal explanation. Because at Corcoran, fights didn't just happen. They kept happening in the same place, in the same way, under the same conditions. And too often, they ended the same way, with gunfire from the guard tower. A yard designed for separation, but not peace. Corcoran operated a high-security yard system where inmates were released into controlled outdoor spaces, typically in small groups. In theory, this setup reduces risk because officers can separate known enemies. But according to multiple accounts published in the 1990s, fights were sometimes happening between inmates who, on paper, should not have been released together. And that is where the scandal begins. If a prison knows who is likely to fight, why would those people be placed on the yard at the same time? In several reports and later federal allegations, investigators claimed that some staff were intentionally allowing rival inmates into the yard together, creating situations where fights became almost predictable. This is where the phrase "gladiator fights" entered public discussion, not as a legal term, more like a description, a way to explain the accusation that violence was being used as a show instead of being prevented. The shooting that changed everything for years. Many shootings at Corcoran were documented in reports, but they didn't break into national conversation in a major way. Then a key factor emerged: video footage. In November 1996, CBS Evening News aired surveillance video showing an inmate being shot during a yard incident from 1994, a moment that triggered public outrage and intensified federal attention. What made the footage so significant wasn't just that a shooting occurred. Prisons have use-of-force incidents across the country. It was the larger question the video created. Were officers responding to danger or responding to a fight that never should have been allowed to start? In the wake of these broadcasts and reporting, Corcoran shifted from a California prison story into a national scandal. Most troubled prison, media spotlight, and investigative pressure. In August 1996, the Los Angeles Times described Corcoran as the most troubled prison in the state at that time, reporting on repeated shootings and serious allegations about officer misconduct. And the numbers were hard to ignore. From 1989 to 1994, multiple sources reported 7 inmates were shot and killed, with dozens wounded in yard shootings at Corcoran, more than at any other prison during that period. As the reports spread, so did another uncomfortable claim: that shootings weren't isolated accidents, but part of an informal culture where escalation was tolerated. The FBI investigation and federal indictments. Once the allegations grew louder, federal investigators moved in. By 1997, 1998, the FBI investigation led to a major step. A federal grand jury issued indictments. On February 26, 1998, the U.S. Department of Justice announced that 8 correctional officers were indicted for civil rights violations and related charges connected to staged fights and the shooting death of inmate Preston Tate in 1994. The DOJ release described allegations that officers encouraged inmates to fight, knew a fight would occur, intentionally failed to prevent it, then prepared false reports afterward. This moved Corcoran into a new category of scandal, because now the claims were not just about harsh prison conditions. They were about criminal accountability, whether the people trusted to enforce the law had violated it. The turning point: the phrase "gladiator fights" became shorthand for a terrifying possibility: that a prison could become a place where violence is not only tolerated, but used as a tool. And yet the case was still not over, because indictments are not convictions. The next question was the hardest one. When the case went to trial, could prosecutors prove what was happening inside Corcoran, beyond any doubt? By 1998, Corcoran was no longer just a prison story. It was a federal case. 8 correctional officers had been indicted, and the allegations were among the most serious the prison system could face. Civil rights violations, conspiracy, and false reports tied to violence that officials were supposed to prevent. But once prosecutors stepped into a courtroom, they faced a problem that appears again and again in cases involving institutional violence. What happens behind walls is hard to prove. And in a prison environment, it can be even harder to find witnesses willing or able to speak openly. Why these cases are so difficult in the outside world. Investigations depend on things like independent witnesses, physical evidence, consistent documentation, and people willing to testify without fear. Inside a maximum security prison, every one of those conditions breaks down. Inmates may avoid speaking because it can put them at risk. Staff may not speak because it can end careers, create retaliation, or isolate them in their own workplace. And when allegations point to a broader culture, prosecutors need more than suspicion. They need proof that holds up in court. The core allegation, the Preston Tate case, one of the central incidents tied to the federal indictments, involved inmate Preston Tate, who was shot and killed during a yard incident in 1994. According to federal allegations, certain officers had set the conditions for violence by releasing known rivals together and then responding with force after the fight began, followed by reports that did not reflect what really happened. From the government's perspective, this wasn't simply a dangerous prison. It was a claim of intentional misconduct, that some staff used violence as a predictable outcome instead of preventing it. The code of silence issue as cases moved toward trial. Journalists and investigators described another obstacle, a long-standing workplace dynamic sometimes referred to as a code of silence. This does not mean every staff member participates. It does not mean every institution is the same. But in many law enforcement settings, including prisons, investigations often run into patterns like reluctance to testify against co-workers' pressure to maintain unity, fear of retaliation, and a belief that outsiders don't understand the job, in public reporting on Corcoran scandal. This concept came up repeatedly as the case developed. Because prosecutors were not just trying to prove an incident happened. They were trying to prove who knew what, who ordered what, and who acted with intent. Court outcomes, not the end many expected over time. The legal outcomes did not fully match the scale of the original allegations. Some cases were dismissed. Others ended in acquittals or reduced accountability compared to public expectations. Reporting from the period describes trials where federal prosecutors struggled to secure convictions that matched the scope of the scandal. And this is where Corcoran became more than a single scandal. Because to many observers, the story revealed a deeper issue. Even when there is strong public suspicion, even when there is video footage, even when the FBI gets involved, institutional cases can still fail in court if the system doesn't provide enough clear, independent evidence. What California did next after the peak of the scandal years, the California prison system faced pressure to change. Policies around yard procedures, use of force, and accountability systems came under more scrutiny. At the same time, Corcoran remained a high-security facility holding inmates considered dangerous or influential inside California's prison gang structure. In other words, the scandal did not erase Corcoran's role. It only changed how the public understood that role. The turning point of Chapter 3. By the end of the trials, two realities existed at the same time. Corcoran had become a national example of alleged prison abuse of power. The legal system struggled to punish that abuse at the level many expected. And that leads to the most important question. If a prison can become so violent that the FBI steps in and still the system struggles to deliver clear accountability, what does that mean for how prisons are managed, monitored, and controlled today? Because Corcoran wasn't only about a few incidents. It was about what happens when an entire environment rewards domination, punishes vulnerability, and turns control into a survival instinct for everyone inside. By the late 1990s, Corcoran had already entered American history as more than a prison. It had become a warning sign about what can happen inside high-security facilities when violence becomes routine, when oversight fails, and when public attention arrives too late. But the Corcoran story did not end with indictments or trials. In many ways, that was only the beginning of a new phase, one shaped by reforms, lawsuits, tighter policies, and yet an ongoing reality. Corcoran remained one of California's most serious prisons, still holding inmates considered high risk. The pressure to reform after the FBI investigation and national media coverage, California corrections faced intense pressure, not just from reporters, but from federal authorities, civil rights lawsuits, families of inmates, and public officials. One key effect of scandal is that it forces institutions to do something they often resist: create paper trails. Prisons respond to scrutiny with more procedures, more reporting requirements, more review panels, because once public trust is damaged, administrators must be able to say, "We can prove what happened." Corcoran's most controversial years had raised doubts about whether official reports could always be trusted. So a logical consequence, seen in many prison systems after major scandals, is increased emphasis on use of force documentation, incident review processes, staff training, internal investigations, and, later, more video monitoring in corrections in general. But reforms inside prisons come with limits. Because the prison environment itself can still produce the same pressures that created violence in the first place. The reality Corcoran never escaped. Even after the Gladiator fight era faded from headlines, Corcoran's operational role stayed largely the same. It was still a high-security institution in a state where overcrowding remained a long-term crisis, gang influence remained significant, and staffing pressure remained constant. In this environment, Corcoran continued to hold inmates tied to major prison gangs and high-profile cases, including individuals whose presence attracted ongoing attention. One of the most publicly known examples was Charles Manson, who spent years at Corcoran before being transferred due to health needs. His presence reinforced Corcoran's reputation as a place that housed some of California's most notorious inmates. But it's important to understand what that symbolism can hide. Corcoran's danger was never only about famous names. It was about the daily structure. The danger cycle. Inside maximum security, high-security prisons operate in a cycle. High-risk inmates are sent there, violence becomes more likely, security tightens, further isolation increases, tension rises again. This creates what many corrections experts describe as a constant pressure cooker effect. When a prison becomes known for violence, it tends to receive the inmates considered most difficult to manage, which increases risk further. That feedback loop is one reason Corcoran's reputation didn't simply disappear after its scandal years. How Corcoran became a symbol. Corcoran entered popular culture and public discussion as shorthand for extreme violence, gang conflict, and allegations of staff misconduct, but it also became a symbol for another uncomfortable truth. Even if you remove the worst actors, the environment can still produce extreme outcomes. This is why many researchers and analysts focus on the system rather than individual villains. Because a single person can be disciplined, a system can run for decades. The unanswered question by the 2000s and beyond, Corcoran was no longer constantly dominating national headlines. But it remained active, operational, and deeply feared, especially by those who understood California prison politics. And that leads to the most important turning point of this chapter. If Corcoran's worst scandal years triggered reforms, and yet Corcoran still remained one of the most dangerous prisons in California, what does that say about the system itself? Were the scandals a rare exception, or were they the visible symptoms of deeper problems that exist across maximum security prisons? After the trials ended and the headlines moved on, Corcoran stayed open, still operating in the same farmland landscape where it was built, and still holding inmates classified as high risk. Today, California State Prison, Corcoran remains a major part of the CDCR system. According to the state's own facility profile, Corcoran includes Level 4 general population housing and also provides specialized mental health housing such as EOP and CCCMS units. That matters because it shows what Corcoran has become in the modern era, not just a violent prison in the popular imagination, but a high-control institution managing a population with extreme custody needs, including significant mental health demands. Violence didn't disappear. It changed form. One of the biggest misunderstandings the public has about prison scandals is this. People assume that once reforms happen, violence stops. In reality, Reforms often change how violence is managed, not whether violence exists. California has continued to face serious violence in its prison system. In fact, in 2025, the Associated Press reported that CDCR imposed strict restrictions, modified programming, in several top security prisons after a surge in violence, with investigations into multiple homicides. Corcoran is part of that wider reality, a maximum security prison system where danger can rise quickly when gangs, contraband, staffing strain, and overcrowding collide. The course shifts since the 1990s, so what's different compared to the Gladiator fight era? The most important change is oversight pressure. The Corcoran scandal did something permanent. It trained the public to look at prisons differently. It created long-term demand for clearer use of force rules, better documentation outside scrutiny, and stronger systems for internal accountability. In other words, Corcoran's history became a lesson that corrections leaders could not afford to forget. Because once an institution is nationally exposed, it does not get to return to invisibility. Corcoran Prison's story is not just about one yard, one case, or one moment on tape. It is about what happens when the most extreme parts of society, serious crime, long sentences, deep trauma, gang power, and institutional control, are pushed into the same closed environment. In the 1990s, Corcoran became known for a pattern of violence so severe that it drew national reporting, federal investigation, and indictments. And even though a jury later acquitted the accused officers, the scandal left behind something that mattered more than any single verdict: a public record showing how fragile accountability can become when power operates in isolation. That is the real meaning of Corcoran. Not a legend, not a myth, not entertainment. A reminder that prisons don't just punish individuals, they test the strength of the systems built to control them. Because when those systems fail, the damage doesn't stay behind bars. It spreads into lawsuits, public distrust, political pressure, and a society forced to face an uncomfortable truth. How we run prisons says as much about us as it does about the people inside them. If you found this documentary educational, please like the video, subscribe for more real-world documentaries, and comment below. What do you think matters more in prison reform, security, punishment, or rehabilitation?